Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Camille. It's a pleasure, a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank my good friend and colleague Yair Avron for making it possible. I'm going to give a set of remarks that focus on my own understanding of the American approach to nuclear strategy under the Obama administration, of which the NPT is a part. So my set of remarks will not be solely or even primarily about the NPT, but where the NPT fits into nuclear strategy. And I served in government in the early part of the first term when the Nuclear Posture Review and other key documents, the Ballistic Missile Defense Review, were produced. So I know that experience quite intimately. And I wanted to try to set the stage for then what I'm going to talk about by first discussing the 4 pillars of the President's nuclear weapons policy. I don't know if you know that, well, first of all, there's still a debate in the United States where the President was born. But it's my understanding he was born in Hawaii. And he went to Occidental College in Los Angeles. Some of you may know it's a very good small liberal arts college in Los Angeles for 2 years, and then transferred to Columbia. And I mention this because evidently while he was at Columbia finishing his undergraduate degree, he wrote a paper for a course on a world without nuclear weapons as an undergraduate student. I don't know anything about the origins of the paper. I've never read the paper, but I know that he wrote such a paper. So that idea has been in his head since he was a teenager or a very young man. I first intersected with this whole process in 2007 when he became a presidential candidate and was asked to be a part of 2 groups, one of which dealt with nuclear weapons issues. So I'm quite familiar with the evolution of what he said and his thinking as a candidate to be president. And it was in 2007 that the so-called 4 horsemen or 4 wise men wrote this op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal calling for a world without nuclear weapons, and they were authors who you wouldn't expect would endorse such a view: Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Sam Nunn, and Bill Perry. And I think that, and this is more a guesstimate on my part, that Senator Obama was very taken by that. That here you have 4 grizzled, Cold Warrior, battle-scarred figures from both Republican and Democratic administrations. But their argument was that the U.S. had vast conventional force superiority. So from a purely American perspective, a world without nuclear weapons might still be a world that favored the United States in military terms. There were disputes about it and so forth, which I'll skip. They wrote another article a year later, still endorsing it, but more recently in 2012, actually Kissinger wrote an article in the Washington Post with Brent Scowcroft, appearing to disassociate himself from the movement. Dr. Kissinger has an ability to, at times, disassociate himself from things. I have to digress for a second. There's something called the Defense Policy Board. Some of you may know about it. It's an advisory group to the Secretary of Defense. And when Gates was Secretary, this group actually reported to Michelle Flournoy, who was the Undersecretary for Policy, who was my boss when I was in the Pentagon. And when there was a subject in your area, you would show up as an assistant secretary. So they had a session on nuclear weapons, and I showed up. And on the Defense Policy Board was Kissinger, who was 87 years old at the time. Now he's 89 years old. He's going to be 90 this year. And at the end of the meeting, I went out. I had met him a few times, but of course he didn't really know me, but I knew him. And I congratulated him, and I said, Mr. Secretary, it's wonderful to see you again. And I'd just like to know, I'd like you to know that I think, this is Michael talking to Kissinger, I'd like you to know that I think you have a bright future ahead of you. I said this to Kissinger. And Kissinger, first of all, he's a little hard of hearing. Physically, he doesn't look so great, but mentally, he is sharp as a tack. He was reaching down for his briefcase because the meeting was over. And so the whole response time was no more than a few seconds. And he picked up his briefcase and he turned to me and he said, "Yes," he said, "I come to meetings like these hoping to be discovered." Which was the single best line I heard while I was in the Pentagon. But that's an aside. In the summer of 2008, Senator Obama, candidate Obama, wrote an article, various people contributed to it, that was in Foreign Affairs, also calling for this same policy to be thought about very seriously. And therefore, it was not surprising that after he became president in April 2009, he gave this major speech in Prague, really announcing that his new administration would really try to make something like this happen. Now, recall, or if you don't recall, just be aware that the speech had a lot of caveats in it. That this was not a world that he, Obama, expected to see in his lifetime. And he was only 45 years old at the time, 40. So it would be 50, 60 years into the future. He also said, and this was later repeated in the Nuclear Posture Review, that as long as there were any countries with nuclear weapons, the United States would have to have a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent. So there was no room in the presentation for basically a unilateral U.S. cut to zero or to very low numbers. Working in the Pentagon at a fairly senior but not at the top level, we were essentially informed that there were the four pillars that would be key to moving down this road. The first was the completion of the New START treaty with Russia, which of course Rose Gottemoeller could speak about at length. She was the chief negotiator. Some of us in the Pentagon were basically backstopping her. We had our own thoughts. Sometimes they were in common, sometimes they were not. But basically to reach that agreement. That was an extremely difficult agreement to reach. She deserves Purple Hearts on top of all other kinds of medals for getting that done. Maybe our Russian colleague could talk about it. But it was it was thought originally in Washington to be a very simple, straightforward follow-on agreement, modest additional cuts. It was a very difficult, laborious in every way. And why was that considered the first step? Because of the so-called Russia reset button, that at least the president felt that under George W. Bush, U.S.-Russia relations had been on a very bad track. And it's not that Obama was just interested in being palsy-walsy with the Russians, but that cooperation with Russia was considered essential to stop nonproliferation, particularly Russian cooperation on the Iranian program, possibly on the North Korean program, and on some other issues too. The second piece of the strategy was to articulate a revised U.S. nuclear strategy, which was the Nuclear Posture Review. And I remember actually on an Easter Sunday in March 2010 at the Pentagon, I was at the Pentagon on Easter Sunday, proofreading the final version before I went to the White House for the president's signature. And he read it twice and had marked it up. So this was, his tens of thousands of documents to look at. They go out under his name, but he doesn't proofread all of them. So, and he had substantive issues to raise with these documents. And that document asserted for the first time in U.S. policy that our dominant concern was nuclear weapon use by terrorists and nuclear proliferation, as distinct from a U.S.-Russia nuclear armed confrontation or something emerging like that with the Chinese or something else, which were thought to have very, very low probability. But the first two were not thought to be low. And by the way, there was a linkage between nuclear terrorism and proliferation, because proliferation in some circumstances could lead to terrorist acquisition and then terrorist use. But again, it emphasized also the need for the U.S. to have a safe, secure, and effective deterrent. And there were $80 billion allocated to the weapons laboratories for 10 years to refurbish a lot of their facilities. I'm quite involved with the weapons lab, so I know a fair amount about it. Some of the facilities go back to World War II. They go back to the Manhattan Project. So they really needed a lot of additional funds. The third element was embodied in the Nuclear Security Summits, which took place first in Washington in May 2010, and then in South Korea, and there will be one more. It may then be morphed into some different format. And the basic idea there was really quite simple, which was that terrorists can't use nuclear weapons if they can't get a hold of the material. And if you can lock up the material, then you can really thwart that problem. So the aim was to have as many countries involved in trying to have very secure control of their nuclear materials, particularly, their reprocessed plutonium and their highly enriched uranium. There was some progress made there. I'll talk about that in a minute, so I have to do all this in about 4 minutes now. And the fourth was the NPT review conference, and strengthened the NPT through the additional protocol and trying to make it more difficult to exit the NPT as North Korea had done. And as part of the negotiations to get that protocol supported, Egypt in particular, still under Mubarak at the time, and other countries insisted on the Middle East Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone Conference, which was the price that the U.S. paid to get some additional support. The U.S. also put more money into the IAEA and a few other things. I had a nice opportunity to speak at the NPT review conference because it was agreed for the first time the U.S. would reveal how many nuclear weapons we had. Secretary of State Clinton announced that we had 5,100, and then three of us, Ellen Tauscher from the State Department, Rose's predecessor, and Tom D'Agostino, head of the the NNSA that stewards the nuclear weapons labs, and myself provided more details. So I was physically there at the UN in a government position at the time. Now, what's happened since? The title of my talk is Recalibrating the Nuclear Vision. So now I'm speaking purely as a Berkeley person. So this is a Berkeley view of a Washington view of a global problem. And I would say, speaking personally, that it's a disappointing experience since these initiatives. Now, it's only a couple of years. It'll be 3 years. The START Treaty was signed in December, ratified later in 2010. The Nuclear Posture Review came out in April. The Nuclear Security Summit started in May, and the NPT Review Conference was in May. So it'll only be coming up to 3 years. It's early, but lots of aspirations have not been achieved. Neither the Russian Federation nor the Chinese, who was also an audience for these things, have in any way really modified their own nuclear weapons development programs, and they have not been especially constructive on proliferation. I mean, I can go into a lot of detail on any of these. Now, maybe you would say, well, that was naive to think that they would be, but there was some hope that, and more than a hope, that this set of moves by the U.S., both declaratory policy and actual physical changes, would engender greater support. It didn't happen. Problems with Pakistan, of course, have worsened terribly in the last several years, in part because of U.S. drone strikes, in part because of violating Pakistani airspace and getting bin Laden, and for a variety of other reasons. But Pakistan's critically important because they've got large amounts of fissile material in a world with a rather limited sovereign government that doesn't control vast areas of the country, that has known terrorist organizations and terrorist leaders residing in the country. So almost all the places where you don't want to have fissile material, Pakistan would be at the top of the list, and yet they've got a lot, and they're building a lot of new weapons. They've recharged their program even more. And by the way, on the Russian side, which our colleague may or may not want to discuss, the fact that the Russians have several thousand shorter range weapons in the western part of Russia is going to be an agenda item for the next arms control negotiation with Russia, if there is one. And it's not at all clear that Russia is really interested in any discussions at all about those weapons. Whether they have them as a work program, whether they have them against the Chinese, whether they have them because of actual concerns about Europe, for whatever set of reasons, they're holding on to those weapons, and it's clearly a very high priority to do so. The Russians, by the way, they're building a new ICBM. And it's actually quite, from a strategic stability perspective, an inappropriate one. It's a liquid-fueled, multi-warhead ICBM, which is a very high-price target. It's not a good sign. In addition to that, we have the continuing problem with North Korea. We have limited options because limited leverage, and North Korea has basically deterred the United States from taking action against the North Korean regime. It follows up on one of Yair's points, that one of the elements of incentive for states to acquire nuclear weapons is to deter the United States from conventional action for regime change. And if anything, ironically and unfortunately, the Libyan case proved their point to others. Libya agrees to get rid of these weapons, and the next thing you know, the U.S. helps get the guy out. So if you're an Iranian, even forgetting about Israel, forgetting about wanting to be a regional hegemon, forgetting about anything else Iran wants to do, they just want to stay in power, the Libyan example to the Iranians is a lesson that we have to get this stuff, and that way the Americans won't mess around with us. And that it's not only the Iranians who said that. In fact, it was an Indian general who said after the first Gulf War that the lesson of that first Gulf War was countries have to have nuclear weapons to deter U.S. intervention. Now, that's not what we had in mind, but that's still the net effect. So for all these sets of reasons, there's a lot of disappointment, and I think there has to be an effort at recalibrating. Now, it's just been publicized in today's New York Times, I don't want to make it current events-y too much, that Obama is considering another major cut in U.S. strategic nuclear weapons. By the way, the agreements only control strategic, that is intercontinental range, deployed nuclear weapons. It doesn't control non-deployed weapons. It doesn't control stored weapons. It doesn't control non-strategic weapons. It controls strategic deployed weapons, which is a subset of the weapons that we have, a subset of the weapons that the Russians have. Biden is going to lead a new initiative with Rose, I believe, to try to get the Russian dialogue on a better track. But there are other problems there. I mentioned I was involved in the Ballistic Missile Defense Review. The Russians and the Chinese are very concerned about the growth of U.S. ballistic missile defenses over the next 7 years or so to 2020, and how they might be able to influence the deterrent. So I'm sort of, what they say in the U.S., just hopscotching across the wave tops here. But the main point is that a lot of what Obama hoped to achieve through the 4 initiatives has not materialized at the pace or in the direction that we had all hoped. And I can tell you there's been a mountain of work by very dedicated, smart people like Rose and others in state, in defense, in the White House, in energy, in the military. And it's been a tough sell. Perhaps the president thinks that, in a way, a doubling down by getting an informal agreement with Putin to reduce the strategic weapons even further might rejuvenate things. But it's not clear to me. Now, there's a lot we can talk about with Iran and so forth, and I'll just have to reserve that for Q&A. But I hope I give you some flavor of the American prism on these issues. Thank you.
Michael, thank you for this.